Hi, I'm Dr. Brian Babcock, and welcome to week 2 of Reading the New Testament. This week we're going to be talking about interpreting the Gospels horizontally. Prior to the work of J.J. Griesbach, most biblical scholars treated the four Gospels as a united whole. Griesbach's work was the first real attempt to investigate the theology of the Synoptic Gospels, which would be Matthew, Mark, and Luke, on an individual basis. He evaluated Matthew, Mark, and Luke by comparing the three and noting the differences and similarities that existed between them. While historical inquiry was still a motivating factor for Griesbach, his analysis pointed the way to a new sort of gospel study in which the messages of Matthew, Mark, and Luke are assumed to have different emphases. The parallels, or passages that are included in multiple gospels, and the differences between them play a more prominent role in the gospel study today. And I'm going to move this a little bit so you can see that we look here, the shared and unique material in the gospel. We have unique material to Matthew, unique material to Luke, unique material to Mark, showing how much, in fact, is shared between the three and shared between any two. And that was the real work of Griesbach in trying to come to a new model for the study of the Synoptic Gospels. As such, this lecture will describe several steps necessary to the interpretation of individual Gospels. These steps are not exhaustive, as other forms of analysis, such as the analysis of plot, characterization, and setting, would also need to be performed. Step 1 is to compare parallel passages in the Gospel, those passages that are found in each of 2 or 3 different Gospels. Identifying parallel passages uses an English Bible and can be fairly difficult unless the Bible you are doing contains cross-references. Several other tools, however, are available to help you identify parallel passages in the Gospels. One of the best was developed by Kurt Aland, titled Synopsis of the Four Gospels. This book provides a side-by-side comparison of the Synoptic Gospels and John. It is available in a Greek and English version, or in English or in Greek-only versions. Both volumes are extremely helpful. Burton Throckmorton produced Gospel Parallels, a comparison of the Synoptic Gospels. This volume compares Matthew, Mark, and Luke in an NRSV translation, as well as references to non-canonical texts such as the Gospel of Thomas. If you are not interested in purchasing a book, there are resources online that provide information concerning the gospel parallels. As late as 2017, a gospel synopsis was available at www.gospelparallels.com. Once you identify the parallels, you can begin your comparison. When you compare the Gospels, you will want to note differences in the words that the Gospel writer utilizes. The arrangement of pericopes before and after the passage in question, and the omissions or additions of information in a given passage. Using the document entitled Matthew 8 Parallel Analysis, which is contained in your course resources, but is also shown here on the slide in our video lecture, compare Matthew 8, verse 23, Mark 4, verse 35, and Luke 8, verse 22. Note that Matthew 8 utilizes the verb follow, whereas the other gospel writers do not. Now take a look at the pericope which precede the accounts of the stilling of the storm in each of the three gospels. Mark includes a parable of the mustard seed. Luke has an account concerning Jesus' mother and brothers, and Matthew contains a pericope on discipline. Note the repetition of the word follow in Matthew 8, verses 19 and 22. This repetition within Matthew 8, 19 to 21, the use of follow in verse 23, and the dissimilarities between Matthew, Mark, and Luke all suggest that Matthew 8 has been crafted to provide a unique message while still containing similar material. Step 2, identify the form of the gospel. Using the document entitled Literary Forms in the Gospels in your course resources, also shown here in the next slide, determine into which category the gospel passage in question fits. Is it a passion narrative, a paradigm, a miracle story, words on discipleship, call narratives, or discourse material? And here it would be a miracle story. So Matthew 8 is most likely a miracle story. Jesus rebukes the winds and the waves and leaves the disciples asking, "What kind of a man is this, that even the winds and the sea obey him?" The passage leaves the reader asking and hopefully answering the same question. When working with the gospel forms, it is important to remember that these forms are generalizations that have been developed by scholars to describe similar passages within the Gospels. The listed forms are not meant to suggest that all passages conform to a rigid set of characteristics, but that passages within the Gospels exhibit a creative adherence to a broad pattern recognizable to gospel readers. Let's look at Luke chapter 5, verses 1 to 11. Luke in chapter 5 provides a good example of the way in which gospel writers used artistic license in the adaptation of gospel forms. The narrative contained in Luke 5 may most readily be identified as a call narrative. This type of narrative This type of narrative is characterized by two preliminary elements. But before we look at it, let's read through Luke 5. On one occasion, while the crowd was pressing in on him to hear the word of God, he was standing by the lake, and he saw two boats by the lake. But the fishermen had gone out of them and were washing their nets. Getting into one of the boats, which was Simon's, he asked him to put out a little from the land. And he sat down and taught the people from the boat. And when he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out into the deep and let down your nets for a catch." And Simon answered, "Master, we toiled all night and took nothing. But at your word, I will let down the nets." And when they had done this, they enclosed a large number of fish, and their nets were breaking. They signaled to their partners in the other boat to come out and help them. And they came and filled both of the boats so that they began to sink. But when Simon Peter saw it, he fell down at Jesus' knees, saying, "Depart from me, for I am a sinful man, O Lord." For he and all who were with him were astonished at the catch of fish that they had taken, and so also were James and John, sons of Zebedee, who were partners of Simon. And Jesus said to Simon, "Do not be afraid, for now on you will be catching men." And when they had brought their boats to land, they left everything and followed him. So, as we look at this passage, this type of narrative is characterized by two primary elements. An imperative in the first person command of Jesus directed towards a particular individual. And then also the immediate, unqualified, dramatic, and obedient response of the individual to Jesus' call. These two elements provide a structure around which the rest of the call narrative is crafted. In the case of Luke 5, verses 1 to 11, we find an interesting modification to this general formula. The first element of the imperative call is actually found in verse 4. Let's go this way. In verse 4, where Jesus calls Simon, "Put out into the deep and let down the nets for a catch." This imperative does not call Simon to follow Jesus or to become his disciple, but to get back in his boat and continue to fish. Simon answers Jesus' command with obedience and a comment making it clear that he and his companions have already finished all night and appear to suggest that catching fish now seems less than less likely. Despite his reservation, Peter is willing to put down the nets at the command of Jesus. Having returned to the shore with a miraculous catch, Simon is struck by his own sinfulness and asks Jesus to leave him, but Jesus simply tells that group not be afraid, because from now on you will catch men. Ultimately, Simon and his companions follow Jesus, but there is never an explicit call by Jesus to do so. In this narrative, the author utilizes an implied call in which the command to set back out to fish acts as the call to follow Jesus and is connected to Jesus' words in verse 10 through the repetition of the word catch. The miraculous catch accounts as a picture of the mission that Simon and his companions will embark on as they follow Jesus to catch men. Here we see the flexibility of the forms and the necessity of exercising our own creativity when interpreting the Gospels. Step 3 is identifying background information. In Matthew 8, it contains an interesting allusion to the Psalms in the mention of the seas and the winds. We see that connection in Psalm 104, Psalm 107, and Psalm 135. Which make mention of God's control over the seas and the wind. And Jesus' rebuke of the winds and the seas provides a clue to his identity. He is God. Step 4, we determine the message of the passage. This step may be divided into two parts. First, you may determine the message of the passage without taking other contextual factors into account. For instance, Matthew 8 is a miracle story that reveals Jesus' divinity. The message of this passage, apart from its context, might be stated as Jesus' control over nature exhibits his divine nature. Second, given the analysis noted in step 1, this message appears somewhat flat. The context of discipleship in chapter 8 and the connection made between chapters 8, verses 18 to 22 and verses 23 to 27 by the repetition of the word follow suggests that the entirety of chapter 8 is concerned with discipleship or following Jesus. Viewing the verses 28 to 27 in context may be best to communicate the message of this passage as, despite danger and discomfort, there need be no fear in following Jesus because He is God. Bringing the information from these 4 steps together, you will be better prepared to understand the Gospels. Thanks for watching, and have a blessed day.